So I have a question for those whether they believe that this is a good argument or isn't a good argument or claim. Now, this is the main statement that you may have heard. A loving and good God does not exist because of all the suffering in the world. Or, because of all the suffering in the world, a good and loving God does not exist. So, my question for you is for those who think that this is not a good argument and also is a good argument, then what in your mind, and forgetting the idea or thought that you wouldn't know God in his mind, so forgetting that, with your mind, what would you want God to do? How would you create a world without suffering? Now, in my mind, if there's to be no suffering in the world, then I would say God would make a suffering that their animals and humans don't die. And the reason for that is that they would not feel the loss of a loved one who passed on or was killed, so they can never die. But let's continue on that thought. If God prevents animals and humans from dying, that means they live forever. That means, although they can have children, there'd be a population cap. So what could God do to prevent the population cap? Well, after a certain amount of time, he could limit the births of people. Like, everyone becomes sterile or they're unable to have children. But then this also causes an issue. Even like now, when people are sterile or infertile and can't have kids, that's a form of suffering and heartache. There's people who are greatly upset because they can't have children, so that would also cause more suffering. Well, and let's say he just creates a massive planet and then runs into the same issue. But now let's say of those people that are reaching the population cap, he somehow teleports those people to another planet that's livable, and these planets can be the size of Jupiter or larger, whatever is allowable, you know? So there's two issues with that. So now the people that would have been sterile, that God would have to make sterile, now teleported to different planets, now they're also missing home. They're missing their friends, their family, causing heartache, another form of suffering. So that wouldn't work. But what about if God just makes like an immense, like heaven, just a huge plane that goes on for infinity, so people can keep having children and animals can keep populating. So here we see, well, no one dies, live forever, you can have as many children as you want, everyone's happy. But then another thought pops in my head where I've heard this said by atheists and skeptics. I don't want to be in heaven because I'd be bored. And that's a valid response. If people are bored, they may choose to do evil things. So prior to this, live forever, people can still do evil things though as well, even if they were on planets that they can never die. But so then the problem of doing evil things from free will, just like what happened in another endless plane, Lucifer in heaven, he rebelled against God. He wanted more. So here we would see that because of people's choices, that suffering would still occur. And similarly on earth, even those who believe in God, they sin. I choose to sin at times, which I'm trying to work on, and I pray to the Lord about that. I even pray to the Lord that he takes away my desire to sin or my will to sin. I'm actively praying to the Lord to just take it all away, take my will to sin away. I'd be grateful if he took it away. And that would be my choice, to allow him to take those desires away from me, as opposed to him forcing that decision on me, that he takes my free will or an aspect of my free will away without my own will deciding that. So let's say God creates this huge heaven, like instead of putting us on earth, he just puts humanity in heaven from the get-go. We all have our free will to sin or not, just like Lucifer did. So there's those who's going to choose to rebel against God, maybe from boredom, or they want more of the power of this perfectness that they are living in. They want to be like God. And there's those who choose to follow God. Depending on their free will, they'll make a choice of what they want to do. Those who want to rebel and those who want to follow God and have their desires to sin removed. And so that's actually an argument for why suffering is allowed to happen and for a loving God to allow it in the first place. Because firstly, this argument is mainly about suffering is inevitable, and there's no way around it no matter what, unless, as I said, the free will desire of removing sin. Because let's go back to the free will aspect. Would a loving God remove our free will? And I only say that because the only way that no suffering would happen, if we are unable to die and could live in endless eternity populating heaven or this infinite planet, would be if God programmed us as robots. And I'm sure we've heard this before. And have no free will. God would have to set limiters and parameters for us to go by. But then what would be the point of having children? What would be the point of endless creatures and humans that never die? What would be the point of the universe? Or God? Or God creating us in the first place? Since that's not love, that's just him programming robots that do his bidding. Now, this may sound like an argument for or against God, but when you think about it, it actually is pretty common sense, because this doesn't happen, and we live in a world where people get to choose who to believe in and what to do with their lives and experience suffering. Life for everything would be pointless, because the only way to make suffering not happen is if we had no emotions, no choices, no life, quote unquote. But then the argument would be, not that how could a loving God be real with all the suffering? The argument would be, well, if we could even have an argument in that state, as having no emotions, no choices, no life, no free will. But the argument would be, how can a loving God use us as dolls with no mind or life of our own? So that wouldn't work. Regarding this argument, that doesn't sound like a loving God either. So the argument wouldn't be as it is now, how can a loving God be real when there's so much suffering in the world? The question would be, because there would be no suffering and no death, how can a loving God use us as dolls with no mind or life of our own? So this argument is to challenge the idea that suffering on the world is not love. Suffering experienced by creatures and humans alike is not a good argument to say that a loving God does not actually exist. Suffering is inevitable. Just like God can't create a square circle or a married bachelor, a loving God can't create a perfect world without suffering, unless we make the first choice to trust in Him and to want to be sinless and have our sin nature taken away from us by our choice. Not being forced as a doll, but by our free choice despite suffering in this world and experiencing the rough life we have. It's kind of like the argument you may hear when people say, I didn't choose to be born. No one can choose to be born, but we can be chosen to be born again. And we can choose, if we want to, have our sin desires taken away from us, to choose to be with the Lord in heaven for eternity. So that is my conclusion to the statement that a loving God, a good and loving God, cannot exist because of all the suffering. My conclusion is, regarding suffering, it's inevitable unless we choose that we don't want to sin and do God's will. Again, I pray to the Lord to take away my sin nature, and I'm willing and wanting Him to take this away. And then He has my permission to remove my sin nature. This is very similar to the gospel. And I didn't want to use the gospel or anything from the Bible, really, no verses, to just have a philosophical thought and share this. I'm the one who trusts in Him and wants to do His will. So if He removes my sin nature, it's very similar to, that would explain why the new heaven and new earth will be perfect. It's those who choose to follow Him and do His will. He's not forcing that decision on us. We're not dolls or programmed to be mindless and not have a life. That is the only way a loving God can create a heaven and earth without suffering. So that's why this world is needed, because we need to go through our life seeing both sides of good and evil and make a decision. Because there is no other way to make a suffer-free world unless we willingly choose to follow Him first, and then He puts us and takes away our desire and puts us in that new heaven and new earth where we don't have to suffer. And then those who choose to suffer, reject God, that's their choice. Counter argument to this, someone may say, well, what about those who, according to the Bible, are going to go to hell and be punished and suffer in hell? Well, as I said in this, I explained how a perfect, suffer-free world or heaven can be done, and that's only by the humans willfully giving their desire to sin up unto the Lord and to remove it. So everyone in that world, in that heaven, will be experiencing no suffering in a perfect world and living for all eternity. And I presume, based on the same components of asking the Lord to take away my sin desires, He's also going to take away any negative feeling, as I also pray to not have. Now that may sound cold of me, since I have family members who claim they're atheists, but there also comes a time, even in now, we have to, not just about this, but about any serious decision or life-altering decision, is these people are old enough that they know what they're doing, or at least they claim to, and who am I to force that on them? I pray for him. I would love to talk to him more. And it's not just one individual, it's a few. But they've made their decision. And I'm hoping by the time they pass away or before, Jesus comes, that they'll make a decision to change their mind and join the Lord. But if they don't, then I pray, and again, it may be selfish of me, but I pray that I will not feel the pain of their choice. And just to say that again, I don't want to feel the pain of their choice. Because that's what it is, their choice. And that's what it'll always be. It'll be their choice. That's why I would have any pain in heaven if I had pain for that reason. The whole thing that I'd be praying not to have. I don't want to have pain or heartache because of their choice that they made. Now people may counter with, well, you said we have to live on earth and experience suffering in order to make a choice. Well, what about those who are aborted or miscarried? Mothers who lose their children, and those children who lose their lives before they're able to make a free will decision. And that'll be another video, which I am currently working on and just need to edit it. It will mainly be more philosophical discussion. I won't be using scripture very much, if at all. just my thoughts and also playing the devil's advocate. And I'm always open to comments on this topic as long as you're civil, and just want to share your thoughts and see what you think. Play the devil's advocate, play God's advocate. Just, you know, there's nothing wrong with asking questions and thinking what is true and what is not true. So what I say, especially in my next video when I'm playing the devil's advocate, may seem odd, but they're really just thoughts that go in my mind about these topics. Because if they're not explicitly said in the Bible, but you also have to follow what the Bible says if we're talking about the biblical God. So it's just about thinking and reasoning and throwing ideas out.